Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sanders, and this is a re-recording of a presentation I gave earlier today at the Harvard Program for the Evolution of Spirituality Conference, 100 Years Rudolf Steiner. We had some audio troubles today, so this is a re-recording for those of you who weren't able to join in person. So with that, let's dive in. As I shared with the folks earlier today, in preparing for this event, I realized that my abstract had attempted to condense my entire dissertation into a very brief presentation. So instead, I'm going to focus on just one of the methodological questions that emerged in the abstract during my project at the intersection of theology and anthroposophy. That is, given the heterogeneous spiritual makeup of Camphill communities in the United States, how can a practical theology of Camphill make use of anthroposophy in a way that does not presume or impose a normative spiritual identity upon community life? So I'll begin by sketching the background and rationale for my study. Then I'll outline my theological approach, informed by John Cobb Jr., John Swinton, and Harriet Mowat, which will define the relationship between anthroposophy as a philosophical and methodological framework and the horizon of Camphill communities as the focus of my study. From here, I'll present my argument for a particular understanding of anthroposophic research, which I try to differentiate from the broader anthroposophical movement under the name indicative anthroposophy or indicative anthroposophic research. This framing enables me to work with anthroposophy as a creative interlocutor without assuming a particular set of spiritual commitments. It furthermore offers a methodology for self-critical reflection within and between anthroposophical initiatives, grounded in the anthroposophical tradition itself. So for background and rationale, my interest in the question of spiritual formation in Camphill communities emerges from the work of theologians focusing on questions of social inclusion and justice. I begin with the assumption, following Mary Fulkerson, that in order for truly inclusive communities to emerge, quote, a deep change of consciousness is required, not simply in the form of new ideas, but in newly developing habituations as well, in the bones. Fulkerson especially targets this call for transformation towards what she calls the dominant subjects in a particular context. That is, those individuals who benefit from the privilege accorded to them by the status quo. Pamela Cushing, an anthropologist, refers to this as a shift in the burden of change from those with disabilities to those without. For Cushing, transformation is not exclusively a passive or receptive process. It's not a natural consequence of exposure to diversity and difference. Instead, it is a clear and deliberate process of what she calls enculturation, by which non-disabled people must develop, quote, the emotional, moral, psychological, spiritual, and technical skills required to turn a generic compassion for people with disabilities into an active and living practice. My project, my doctoral dissertation, attempts to locate this same process within Camphill communities in the United States, where the cultivation of truly inclusive communities sits explicitly at the core of the movement's mission. Now, my own theological position is not one of a particular confession or denomination, but a contextual or situated theology emerging from within and through the Camphill movement. To this end, I work with John Cobb Jr.'s process theological framework, incorporating as well practical theology as described by Swinton and Mowat. Adopting Tillich's notion of faith as the state of being ultimately concerned, Cobb defines theology as, quote, any coherent statement about matters of ultimate concern that recognizes that the perspective by which it is governed is received from a community of faith. This definition includes both a content and context criterions, which make it particularly effective for working theologically in spaces and communities that are not typically understood as engaging in theological activity or who don't see themselves as such, including Camphill communities. At the same time, it doesn't leave the definition of this conversation so open that theology becomes indistinguishable from other forms of discourse. For the Camphill movement, the degree to which a community's self-understanding relates to ultimate concerns or more preliminary concerns in Tillich's usage, such as social inclusion and care, will influence the degree to which its own discourse can be understood as properly theological. Even those communities that have, in Dan McCannon's estimation, evolved beyond community may nevertheless recognize their mission as being fundamentally oriented towards questions of ultimate concern, even if the more traditional elements of communitarianism and anthroposophic spirituality no longer hold a central place in the community's life. Cobb's theological framework thus enables us to expand McCannon's assessment of Camphill's developmental possibilities as including not only communal practices such as life sharing, income sharing, and so on, but also the degree, persistence, and forms by which communities engage with these questions of ultimate concern. Now, fundamental to this theological activity for Cobb is a revised understanding of what constitutes natural theology, which Egil Asprem has unpacked quite a lot in his book, The Problems of Disenchantment, as a form of practice for Western esoteric movements. So it's very relevant for an anthroposophically oriented community such as Camphill. Now, Cobb, in a departure from how natural theology is often defined, describes natural theology as a process of evaluating and adapting general philosophical frameworks for theological ends, as a way of investigating, critically working with our basic presuppositions about reality. Therefore, the work of natural theology consists in evaluating which philosophical and methodological frameworks prove to be the most fruitful for the aims of a particular community of ultimate concern. This activity is theological rather than just strictly philosophical because, in Cobb's words, quote, in appropriating and developing philosophical material, theologians must recognize that their selection and adaptation of this material expresses their particular perspective formed in the community from which they speak. Practical theology, in Swinton and Mowat's approach, does a similar thing, except instead of being oriented towards general philosophical frameworks, they look at particular qualitative methodologies and evaluate their congeniality for theological work. In their words, converting these methodologies for use in a larger practical theological project of enabling fruitful participation, however that may be defined for a particular community of faith. Therefore, a theology of Camphill, the community of ultimate concern to which my own understanding in this project is indebted, demands a critical reflection on how anthroposophy, among other traditions, can be appropriated for theological inquiry as a philosophical and methodological framework, without assuming that the members of that community claim anthroposophy as their personal spiritual identity. To do this, I'll begin with a disambiguated definition of anthroposophy as I use it in my work, and then elaborate this into an overall methodological perspective. So, in Anthroposophy, a Fragment, Steiner attempts to describe the distinctly anthroposophical path of knowledge, and then demonstrates this particular path through a phenomenological exploration of the senses. In this unfinished text, Steiner places anthroposophy as a methodology or epistemological position rather than as a body of content between two polar methodologies and their underlying philosophies. These two are, on the one hand, what we would consider the typical empirical sciences, represented synecdochally as anthropology on the one side, and on the other, esoteric spiritual science or theosophy. Anthroposophy, now narrowly bounded between these two polar methods, begins with, in Steiner's description, the same approach to data and observation as the empirical sciences. However, it does so in a way that creates an open space or an open possibility to point towards or indicate spiritual aspects of phenomena, which an idealist theosophy, on the other hand, attempts to derive from direct revelatory experience, visionary experience. So this evocative picture demonstrates the importance of being quite specific in how we use the term anthroposophy and what we mean by anthroposophy in a methodological context. Research that can be called, in my framing, indicative anthroposophic in the sense of the fragment is that which, one, proceeds from a direct embodied encounter with the phenomenon at hand, two, concerns phenomena that can be directly encountered or experienced by other human beings, regardless of their degree of training in spiritual cognition. Three, proceeds from this to phenomenological exploration in the vein of Goethean and imaginative cognition, as Steiner describes elsewhere in his methodological works. And four, offers provisional interpretations or indications concerning the spiritual foundations or elements of those phenomena. Now, according to such a narrowed methodological definition, significant portions of Steiner's work might be designated as theosophic rather than anthroposophic, insofar as works belonging to the former category make definitive claims based on direct, intuitive perceptions of spiritual phenomena without recourse to broadly accessible experiential data. This then raises the question of how other sources of knowledge, beyond those coming out of an embodied phenomenological encounter, should be treated, especially such theosophic claims concerning spiritual phenomena that comprise a significant portion of the anthroposophical, generic anthroposophical tradition. Now, while Steiner emphasizes in various places the theoretical possibility of anyone developing the requisite clairvoyant capacities to independently verify his esoteric claims, I, at least, make no claim to be able to do this. And so I'm faced with a choice, with a question of how to work with Steiner's claims. Now, one possibility would be to treat them as something of working hypotheses, as if these claims reflected reality. Now, this is a limitation and a wager that we make with any secondary research that relies on the reports of others as source material. And As with other research, this can cause significant issues when either this sort of reliance on others' work is not made explicit, or when there are flaws in that work upon which we have based further investigation. And furthermore, from an indicative anthroposophic perspective, the risks of doing this are actually quite severe. Elaborating Steiner's Goetheanism, adopting and applying the spiritual concepts or mental pictures of others as definitive and normative, that is, as something of a proxy for our own embodied phenomenological experience, redirects the knowledge process towards those mental pictures rather than towards the phenomenon itself. The resulting imagination therefore risks committing what Whitehead refers to as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, in which we mistake abstractions or mental pictures for actual realities, for phenomena in the world with which we could participate and engage. While misplaced concreteness is inevitable in our everyday pragmatic learning and cognition, it undermines this sort of Goethean imaginative process that underlies anthroposophic research by potentially introducing, what Bortoft calls a counterfeit whole. This counterfeit is an abstraction that eliminates or suppresses the particularities and variabilities of a given phenomenon as it manifests in the world. By contrast, an authentic whole, like the archetype or informing idea that we're able to encounter in our engagement with the phenomenal world. This informing idea produces variety. It unfolds itself towards individualization and diversification, and it interacts creatively with concrete environmental circumstances. Especially in the case of research concerning human beings or human social phenomena, a direct encounter with the particular, not the general, is of utmost importance, as Steiner describes in his reflections on Goethe's epistemology. And therefore, particularly in human research or social research, this risk of the counterfeit or proxy can quickly turn into dehumanizing trains of thought, as articulated in different ways in both Traub and Ruhl's work. Now, when we can't perceive a particular phenomenon ourselves and therefore rely on a proxy, we enter into what Henri Bortoft calls a relationship of appropriation rather than direct participatory understanding. In appropriation, we create our own meaning of the phenomenon, quote, in a way that expands rather than transforms our understanding, such that, quote, understanding remains under the control of the subject. Such understanding, then, is explicitly subjective, as opposed to the objective understanding sought through the Goethean imaginative process. Now, appropriation, therefore, does still engender a form of understanding, and it is a useful activity, but it's of a fundamentally different horizon than the Goethean process. Direct participatory knowledge that we try to enter into through the Goethean process deals with a fused or transformed horizon between myself and the phenomenon, whereas appropriated knowledge deals with an expanded horizon of the self. Sometimes I've used the example that we're maybe familiar with in cultural life as cultural appropriation. This obviously has a negative connotation, but it's somewhat helpful actually in describing what Bortoft means by appropriation. Because you can imagine in the context of cultural appropriation that I'm not trying to be transformed by what I'm encountering in the other. I'm extracting something out of the other for my own purposes, for my own decoration, entertainment, amusement, an expansion of the self rather than an openness to real direct participatory transformation, learning about the other. I'm really just growing the self. So that picture of cultural appropriation, if we take away that one, is obviously has a negative connotation, but if we look at that same sort of process in a neutral way, this is sort of the direction that Bortoft is going in with appropriation. Therefore, as part of an indicative anthroposophic orientation, Sheeran suggests the need to, quote, constantly preserve a deliberate distance between what one knows oneself through this sort of direct encounter and research and the knowledge contained in Steiner's works, which I would say is knowledge operating as a proxy for our own experience. The distinction between direct and appropriated understanding is key to safeguarding individual freedom concerning esoteric content and spiritual authority. In this case, spiritual authority is limited to the degree that the free individual can meaningfully appropriate esoteric content, meaningfully and consciously appropriate this content. As Steiner describes in the stages of higher knowledge, quote, I'm not free when someone tells me something and I simply accept it under the compulsion of authority. But I'm equally unfree when I cut myself off from the good that I might receive in this way. Therefore, Steiner is distinguishing between simply adopting something, but also a more radical stance saying we can't engage in anything that we don't directly experience ourselves. So he continues, the right way is not blind subjection to what is received, but to leave ourselves open to suggestion, receiving it impartially so that we may freely acknowledge it. An outside authority should exert no more influence than to make one say, I make myself free just by following the good in it. That is to say, by making it my own. Authority based on esoteric wisdom will exert influence only in this way. Now, whether the claim that esoteric authority only exerts influence in this way is, of course, debatable. Nevertheless, making it my own in Steiner's framing here is neither acceptance nor rejection of a proposition on the basis of the authority of the mediator or a sort of proxy report from another. Neither is it a claim to direct knowledge or as an adequate proxy for direct knowledge. Rather, this making it my own is an appropriative strategy used to expand my own subjective understanding. Now, elsewhere in his works, which is beyond the time we have today, Steiner describes or points towards some specific, what I'm calling appropriative strategies, specific ways that we can make use of esoteric content. But I think it's really important to clarify, again, in this way that Bortoft speaks about it, that this sort of appropriated knowledge, this proxy sort of knowledge, is an expansion of my own subjective understanding, as opposed to a replacement or a substitute for direct embodied phenomenological encounters. Now, the approach that I've outlined here with working with more esoteric content or phenomena with which we're not able to engage directly through a conscious practice of appropriation is distinct from work conducted by other anthroposophical researchers that suggests that Steiner maybe has been misunderstood by anthroposophists who take his spiritual communications, quote, in terms of empirical fact rather than in terms of heuristic principles. Now, while my own research relies on very similar sources and draws very similar boundaries around Steiner's esoteric work, as that conducted by scholars who tend towards this sort of demythologizing of Steiner. I disagree with the implicit suggestion contained in some of these writings that this sort of bracketing of more esoteric claims, or what we could call theosophic claims, using the language of the fragment, I disagree with the implicit suggestion that bracketing that information is sort of a correction to wayward anthroposophic discourse. The suggestion that you sometimes come across that Steiner always or consistently intended that his more theosophic claims, his more esoteric work, be treated strictly heuristically or symbolically, or that anthroposophy, quoting Kirsch, quote, restricts itself to descriptions of methods only, rather than making declarative, definitive claims about spiritual reality, is simply at odds with Steiner's own defense of anthroposophy as a legitimate and productive branch of inquiry, offering precisely these sorts of definitive claims. For instance, if you read the Character of Esoteric Science section from his Outline of Esoteric Science. Therefore, developing a coherent anthroposophic methodology is not a matter of educating confused anthroposophists in their orthodoxy. Instead, it's a matter of determining within what Sheeran recognizes as a largely unsystematic tradition, particular ontological and epistemological lineages from which meaningful research can unfold. Now, while I hope to make an argument for the integrity and fruitfulness of a limited indicative anthroposophy that is congruent with the broader anthroposophical tradition, this does not exclude the possibility of charting other, even contradictory methodologies. For instance, methodologies that grant Steiner and Steiner's work a special epistemological, revelatory, or even scriptural status. Now, I personally may be critical of such methodologies, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible to find support for their assumptions within the broader anthroposophical tradition. The point is to make our methodologies clear and explicit so that we can evaluate research conducted within and beyond and building out of the anthroposophic movement in a legitimate and grounded way. So then, returning to my own theological research, I should explain why I believe a limited view, this more narrowed view of anthroposophic, indicative anthroposophic methodology, is more amenable to a practical theological project than, say, Steiner's Christology. If we take theology as coherent statements about matters of ultimate concern that recognize their indebtedness to a particular community, my community is not that of anthroposophy writ large, but rather of the lived experience of the Camphill movement. The core question then is not what sort of theology Steiner engages in, but what conversations of ultimate concern Camphill communities engage in, or, from a practical theological lens, should be engaging in, shaped by their history, their situation in the contemporary landscape of service provision in American culture, their socioeconomic realities, and, of course, the needs and hopes of their individual members, just to name a few of the influences. Practical theology, like I mentioned, goes actually beyond description of these sorts of conversations toward a more activist project. So as Swinton and Moat define it, practical theology is, quote, critical theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to ensuring and enabling faithful participation in God's redemptive practices in, to, and for the world. Practical theology, under such a definition, is therefore not strictly applied theology, taking the orthodoxy and orthopraxy articulated through doctrinal theology and applying it in practical life. Instead, it locates theological question, those questions of ultimate concern, within the fabric of ordinary life, the life of the world. These conversations and struggles with these questions become challenges in the mode of a prophetic challenge to the tradition of faith itself. Thus, practical theology takes as its primary goal, quote, guiding and transforming of future practices that will inform and shape the life of faith, end quote. Now, for Camphill, of course, this definition of theology needs revision. Nevertheless, ultimately, what it means to participate faithfully in Camphill's mission is going to be defined and is defined daily by Camphillers and Camphill history in their actuality. Anthroposophy, of course, plays a significant role in shaping not only community practice, but the community's self-identity and what we might call its daily liturgy. However, Camphill is not a monastic community comprised of individuals taking on the orders of a particular faith. Nevertheless, the lived experience of dissolution across the Camphill movement, which is at least partially attributed to a thinning out of anthroposophical spirituality, has provoked a lot of soul searching and a question of whether anthroposophy is necessary for Camphill's future development. You hear similar questions in other practical, so-called practical initiatives coming out of anthroposophy, including the Waldorf school movement, biodynamic agriculture, and so on. Now, at the same time as these concerns are unfolding, Camphill is emerging in new social, cultural, and religious contexts internationally. For a movement such as Camphill, therefore, whose membership is not limited to self-identified anthroposophists, but does understand itself as being rooted in anthroposophy, this move of practical theology and of Cobb's natural theology enables us to relate the movement's anthroposophical inheritance in a way that meaningfully supports spiritual diversity and an evolution of spiritual diversity as part of the movement's mission. Therefore, I believe that a more limited indicative anthroposophy actually provides the philosophical and methodological framework that meaningfully supports this kind of theological activity, this wrestling with questions of ultimate concern. Such an approach still preserves space for anthroposophically informed theologies of a more overtly esoteric bent, of which the Christian community is a prime example. Michael Debus's work really illustrates this very clearly, how the Christian community, in the language I'm using here, actually appropriates anthroposophy for its own theological conversations. Moreover, I think this sort of treating this more limited, narrowed anthroposophic approach, as described in the fragment, gives us a model by which communities of practice can draw upon a wide variety of sources for theological reflection, not only anthroposophy. For example, acknowledging and constructing a Moravian practical theology of Camphill would be of immense value to the movement's self-understanding, as would what Cobb describes as historical theology, gathering as much of the real objective, non-hagiographical representations of a particular community's founders and history as a way of really expanding communities' self-understanding and incorporating that into these conversations of ultimate concern. Therefore, in closing, I hope that the theological activity of appropriation, of appropriating these sort of congenial philosophical and methodological frameworks as described in Cobb, Swinton, and Mowat, can provide new opportunities for anthroposophic research rooted in the so-called practical initiatives of the broader anthroposophical movement, while clearly demonstrating the legitimacy of such an approach as emerging out of the anthroposophical movement itself. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.